In the early months of the Second World War, when the Atlantic was still the heart of German naval ambitions, most officers of the Kriegsmarine carried a single image of how wars at sea would be fought. To them, the ocean was a chessboard where battleships were kings, cruisers were queens, and submarines, U-boats, were the shadowy assassins that could strike at will. The very idea that the future of naval warfare might belong to something else, something as unconventional as an airfield floating on steel, was almost laughable. Aircraft carriers were seen as support ships, fragile vessels that needed to be guarded. Not war winners on their own. The British had them, yes, but in small numbers, and German officers considered them little more than experiments, vulnerable to a single well-aimed torpedo or bomb. The sea, they believed, was still ruled by armor and gunnery. But reality has a way of tearing down illusions. The first time German officers heard reports of America's aircraft carriers, they treated them as exaggerations, stories, told by submarine captains who had been at sea too long. These men returned from Atlantic patrols with tales of enormous silhouettes cutting across the horizon, ships so large they seemed to defy reason. These were not the small carriers of the Royal Navy, but floating fortresses, almost the size of the Bismarck, yet carrying no heavy guns, only aircraft. It sounded absurd. How could such ships survive without the armor of a battleship? How could planes launched from a deck at sea possibly replace the range and power of naval artillery? The skepticism was almost universal until the war began to show them the truth. One of the earliest shocks came through the U-boat fleet. For years, Germany's submarines had been the terror of the Atlantic, striking convoys under cover of darkness and slipping away into the depths. But suddenly things were different. Convoys that had once been easy prey now had constant air cover, even in waters far beyond the reach of land-based aircraft. U-boat commanders began reporting mysterious planes that appeared out of nowhere, circling above like vultures, forcing them to dive early and ruining their attacks. At first, Berlin assumed these planes were flying from secret bases on some hidden island or coast. The truth was worse. They were flying from carriers, from mobile airfields that could move wherever they were needed, sweeping the ocean clean. For the men trained to believe in the invincibility of the U-boat, this was unsettling. The hunter was now being hunted. German intelligence tried to downplay the threat. Reports came in of the American Yorktown-class carriers, and later of something even larger, ships with flight decks, so long they could launch entire squadrons of aircraft in minutes. These were not auxiliary craft. They were weapons in their own right, able to scout hundreds of miles, strike with precision, and protect entire fleets. Some German officers still clung to the belief that a single lucky hit could cripple such a ship. But then came reports from the Pacific, from their Japanese allies, describing what these carriers were truly capable of. The Battle of Midway sent shockwaves through every naval command in Europe. 4 Japanese carriers, symbols of their naval might, had been destroyed in a single engagement. And it wasn't a traditional battle fought with shells and torpedoes. The ships never even saw each other. The entire fight had been decided by planes launched from decks, hundreds of miles apart. To German minds trained in the traditions of surface warfare, this was almost unthinkable. The age of the battleship was ending, and a new age had arrived. And yet, hearing about the carriers was one thing. Seeing them, truly seeing them, was another. Some of the most striking accounts came from German prisoners of war who were taken aboard American carriers after capture. They spoke of hangar decks that stretched like cathedrals, of elevators that lifted planes as if by magic, of crews working in perfect synchronization. They described the sound of engines roaring on the flight deck, the smell of aviation fuel, the endless rows of aircraft waiting like hawks to take to the sky. Compared to the cramped, suffocating life aboard a U-boat, it was like stepping into another world. The sheer scale of these ships was enough to humble even the proudest officer. A single American carrier, they realized, was the equivalent of several airfields moving together, bringing an entire war with them wherever they went. Perhaps most shocking of all was the speed with which America built them. German shipyards labored for years to produce a single battleship, each one a political event, a matter of national prestige. But across the Atlantic, carriers were being launched at a pace that defied belief. The Essex class, they were told, was rolling off production lines like factory goods. To German officers, who had seen their shipbuilding program crippled by Allied bombing and material shortages, this was almost otherworldly. The Americans did not just have a weapon. They had an entire system designed to replace, replenish, and expand it. To sink one carrier was meaningless when another, newer one was already on the way. For the first time, many German officers began to feel that the war at sea was tilting beyond their control. It wasn't just about strategy anymore. It was about a kind of power they could not match, the power to build, to sustain, to project force anywhere on the planet. The carriers were more than ships. They were symbols of a nation that had turned its industry into an unstoppable war machine. To stand on the deck of one was to understand that this was not merely a fleet. It was a declaration of intent. The Americans had chosen a new way to fight, and the rest of the world would have to adapt or be crushed. The first time a captured German officer walked across the flight deck of an American carrier, he felt as though he had stepped onto another planet. The deck stretched so far that it seemed to merge with the horizon. A massive expanse of steel, alive with motion. Sailors in color-coded shirts darted back and forth like pieces on a living chessboard, guiding aircraft with practiced precision. The officer stopped for a moment, mesmerized by the sight of a Hellcat fighter being towed into position, its wings folding down like the talons of a predatory bird. The smell of fuel and hot metal filled the air. The sound of engines rumbling below deck vibrated through his boots. Everything about this place spoke of power, of relentless organization, of a kind of warfare he had never imagined. Below decks, the sense of scale was even more overwhelming. The hangar bay was like an enormous cathedral, a cavern of steel where dozens of planes were lined up in perfect rows, mechanics swarming over them with tools, checking engines, arming bombs. The officer could not help but think of German shipyards, where even a single plane being repaired was an event worth noting. Here, aircraft were treated like ammunition, used, serviced, launched again, without pause. The Americans seemed to have mastered the art of turning war into routine, as if this massive operation was just another day's work. German officers had been taught that war was a matter of heroics, of bold decisions and daring maneuvers. But what they saw aboard a carrier was something different. War as a machine, war reduced to process and efficiency. There was no chaos, no wasted movement. Every sailor knew his place. Every order was carried out instantly. When the alarm for flight operations sounded, the entire ship seemed to transform. Planes were rolled into position, fuel lines were connected, bombs were hoisted into place. Pilots climbed into cockpits. Within minutes, the flight deck was alive with engines screaming at full power, one aircraft after another leaping into the sky. For the German officers, used to thinking of air power as something tied to fixed bases on land, this was nothing short of revolutionary. These carriers could be anywhere, near Norway one week, in the Mediterranean the next, or striking deep into the Pacific. They could carry the war to any coast, any port, and there was no way to predict where the next blow would fall. Even more unnerving was the realization that these ships did not act alone. They traveled in groups, task forces that included battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and supply ships, all centered around the carrier like planets orbiting a sun. The carrier was the heart of this floating city, and its aircraft were the beating pulse, always ready to strike. Some German prisoners later admitted to feeling a strange mix of fear and respect. Fear, because they now understood that there was no place on the ocean truly safe from these floating airfields. Respect, because what they witnessed was not just brute force but extraordinary discipline and skill. The Americans, they realized, were not winning the war simply because of numbers. They were winning because they had found a new way to fight, one that relied on constant training, perfect coordination, and overwhelming mobility. There were stories of German U-boat commanders who had been forced to surface near a convoy after being damaged, only to find themselves facing aircraft circling above, planes that had come from a carrier hundreds of miles away. The planes did not attack recklessly. They waited, they radioed positions, and soon destroyers closed in for the kill. It was a slow, methodical hunt, one that gave the Germans no chance of escape. Being captured under those circumstances was humiliating enough, but being brought aboard a carrier afterwards was like being shown the future of naval war, a future in which the submarine would no longer be the hunter but the prey. The psychological impact was profound. One officer wrote later that the most unsettling thing was not the size of the ship, nor the number of planes, but the sense that the Americans were only getting started. "They build these ships as we build trucks," he wrote in his diary. "We labor years to make one vessel. They will launch 3 before the paint on this one is dry." He was not exaggerating. By 1943, The United States was commissioning carriers at a pace that stunned even its allies. Shipyards ran day and night, welding and riveting, turning out hulls faster than Germany could hope to sink them. Inside the carrier, life went on with a rhythm that seemed impossible for such a massive crew. There were galleys that fed thousands of men, sleeping quarters stacked with bunks 3 high, medical bays, briefing rooms, even chapels. It was a self-contained world, a floating city with its own laws and routines. For the Germans, who came from a navy where everything felt smaller, tighter, and more desperate, it was hard not to feel a pang of envy. Here was a navy that seemed confident, even relaxed, despite the war raging across the globe. And yet, beneath the calm, there was a quiet, relentless intensity. The carrier was never still for long. As soon as one group of planes returned, another was prepared to launch. Bombs were loaded, fuel lines were connected, pilots were briefed on new missions. Day and night, the cycle repeated, a tireless rhythm of attack and recovery. The Germans watching from the sidelines realized that this was a war. Germany could not win by courage alone. This was a war of endurance. And America had more endurance than they had ever imagined. By the time those captured officers were transferred to POW camps, many of them had changed the way they saw the conflict entirely. The image of the carrier's endless deck, the roar of engines taking off one after another, stayed with them. It was more than just a memory. It was a warning. The war they had once thought of as a contest between battleships and submarines had become something far larger, something they could no longer control. Weeks passed, but for many German officers who had once believed in the invincibility of their fleet, the memory of those American carriers never faded. Even in captivity far from the sea, they found themselves replaying the sights and sounds over and over in their minds. Some would close their eyes and hear again the roar of aircraft, engines as they thundered off the deck, one after another like a relentless drumbeat. Others remembered the strange calm on board, the way the crew moved with quiet confidence, as though they knew victory was only a matter of time. It was this calmness that unsettled them most. War, as the Germans had known it, was supposed to be filled with chaos, uncertainty, desperation. But aboard those carriers, it felt like everything was under control. As news filtered into the POW camps, the picture became even clearer. Reports came of German convoys ambushed by carrier-based planes in the Arctic, of U-boats destroyed by hunter-killer groups led by escort carriers, of battles in the Pacific where American carriers had turned entire campaigns with a single strike. For officers who had once placed their faith in the power of the Bismarck, the Tirpitz, and the U-boat wolf packs, these stories were like nails being hammered into the coffin of their old worldview. The carrier, they now knew, was not just a weapon. It was a revolution, a weapon that rewrote the very rules of naval war. One officer, once a believer in the U-boat strategy, wrote bitterly in his diary that the ocean had become a sky battlefield. It no longer belonged to the submarine or the surface raider. It belonged to the aircraft overhead. He admitted that he now feared the shadow of planes more than the depth, charges that once haunted him. It was a complete reversal. The hunter had been turned into the hunted, and there was no pride left in that transformation. As the war dragged on, more and more German sailors and officers were captured and brought aboard carriers before being shipped to prison camps. Each of them carried home the same story. The Americans had built something that could not be stopped. The scale, the efficiency, the relentless pace of construction. It was beyond anything the 30 Reich could match. Germany, they realized, was fighting a war it could not possibly win, not against an enemy who could build faster, strike farther, and replace losses before the paint had dried on a new ship's hull. For some, the experience led to a deep, quiet despair. They had entered the war believing in the might of the Kriegsmarine, in the U-boat arm that would starve Britain into submission, in the battleships that would rule the Atlantic. But those dreams were gone. The ocean no longer felt like German territory, no longer a place where they could move unseen. Every horizon now seemed to hold the possibility of a carrier, lurking just beyond sight, ready to launch its squadrons without warning. Yet there was also a strange sense of admiration. Many officers later admitted that they could not help but respect what they had seen. The Americans had taken an idea that most navies considered secondary and turned it into the core of their power. They had trained men to work in perfect coordination. They had built an industry that could outproduce entire continents. And they had done it all with a level of speed and organization that was almost frightening. Even the most hardened German officers could see that this was not merely luck or numbers, it was vision. The United States had understood, before anyone else, that the future of naval warfare belonged to the air, not the gun. By 1944, when the tide of the war had clearly turned, even German high command could no longer deny the truth. Plans for their own carriers, the Graf Zeppelin and others, had long been abandoned or left incomplete. The resources simply did not exist, and even if they had, it was too late. The Americans had already mastered the art, already filled the oceans with floating airfields that could cover every corner of the globe. Germany could not hope to catch up. The officers who had once scoffed at the idea of carriers now knew that their skepticism had cost them precious years, years that might have changed the course of the war. When the war finally ended and Germany lay in ruins, many of those who had once walked the decks of American carriers carried that memory with them for the rest of their lives. Some wrote memoirs describing the awe they had felt, the fear, the grudging respect. Others never spoke of it, ashamed to admit how much it had shaken them. But all of them, in their own way, had been forced to confront the same truth. The age of the battleship was over, and the future had arrived in the form of those massive floating fortresses. For historians, the testimony of these men became invaluable. It offered a window into the moment when Germany's naval war was lost, not just on the charts of admirals or the decks of ships, but in the minds of the men who fought it. The carriers had not only destroyed ships, they had destroyed hope. They had shown that war could be fought with such scale, such reach, and such precision that resistance was no longer a matter of courage but of inevitability. And so, in the end, the story of the German officers' first encounter with American aircraft carriers is more than a tale of steel and fire. It is the story of a transformation, the moment when an old world died and a new one was born. A world where the ocean no longer belonged to those who could build the biggest guns, but to those who could command the skies. A world that would shape every naval battle for decades to come.